This week's parsha is Parshat Chukat. And as we sort of start to near the end of the journey of Bnei Israel, I always think it's interesting to spot the similarities between beginning of the journey problems and end of the journey problems. Noting, of course, that 39 years is a long time. So it's not really fair for me to say, like, why didn't they learn their lesson at the beginning and apply it to the end? But I think that in this week's parsha, we see both Bnei Israel's sort of recycling of a problem and a behavior, and also of Moshe's, which makes it a little more interesting and teaches us hopefully something about how we relate to problems and how we process challenges, and like what are the ideals there, maybe is the way to think about it. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and we're going to look at, let's see if that worked. Yes, okay. We're going to look at at our parsha and then back all the way to the beginning in like year one of leaving Egypt, to think about a comparison case. So in this week's parsha, we see what I would say is like the heartbreaking consequence of hitting the rock, right? We see that Miriam has just died. This is in the beginning psukim here in Bamidbar, chapter 20, verses 1-5, right? We've come to Midbar Tzin in Chodesh HaRishon, in the first new moon, and we stay there in Kadesh, and Miriam dies there. And a lot of the text and the midrash around Miriam talk about her being like a person of water, and that the water sort of followed Miriam, right? And so once Miriam dies, the community is without water, and they turn to the remaining two siblings, to Moshe and to Aaron, right? And they say here, why have you brought us? Lama hevetem es kahal Hashem el hamidbar hazel lamut sham anachnu uveirenu. Right? Why have you brought the God's congregation into the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Right? And this is a very, I think, common refrain of Bnei Israel in a lot of ways. Right? The Lama ha'ali tanumi mitzrayim. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Right? That even 39 years later, the distance of time has not taken off that sort of anxiety of returning to the place of enslavement, right? Why did you take us out of Egypt, to this bad place where there is nothing, right? Lo mekom zera ute'ena ve'gefen b'rimon umayim ayin lishtot, right? There's no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. There's not even water to drink. And this is sort of that anxious refrain that we've heard before, right? At least in Egypt, we had food to eat. Here, we're going to die of thirst. And in fact, if we look back again to the first year when we've left Egypt, way back in Shemot, Yud Zayin, chapter 17, the people were thirsty, V'itzma sham ha'am lamayim, and they grumbled against Moshe. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst, right? Very similar refrain. And I was thinking today, as it is humid and sort of sticky, but not super hot, that as we prepare for our summertime fasts, right, there's like an enormous amount of anxiety in the world of fasters around summer fasting, and like how many Powerades you drink versus other waters, and when you have to drink, right, more than 24 hours before or within the 24 hours. And that's when we know that within 25 hours, we can go back to drinking. And here, right, there is like no end in sight. And so on some level, like you understand the anxiety of Bnei Israel. And on the other hand, I think when you see both of them together, you can't help think, like, did the people learn nothing, right? Every time the people have complained, even if Moshe gets mad or God gets mad, they're provided for, right? And we even see that in Shemot, so going back, right, sticking with Shemot, that right, Moshe is mad. Moshe, a new young leader, says, what am I going to do with these people? They're going to kill me if I don't give them water. And Hashem says, right, go before the people, take with you some backup, take along the rod with which you struck the Nile and set out. and we're going to talk more about the sticks in a little bit. But then Moshe is commanded to hit the rock and water comes out and the people have water. And so on some level, I was thinking like, what is wrong with these people? Like, haven't they learned that they could just ask for what they need and that it will be provided to them? Why do we have the quarrel, right? Or the grumbling about this anxiety about leaving Egypt? Surely it is better to leave Egypt, especially now when we're sort of on the precipice of entering the land of Israel. Where is the hope? Where is the understanding? Where's that connection to God? That might have helped Bnei Israel ask a different kind of question, right? Maybe that's like, I've spent a lot of time with my children by design, but sometimes they have been whiny this summer. And right, and I say, well, if you ask nicely, you're more likely to get what you want, right? And it seems to me like that's sort of similar here. But who gets punished in the story? It is not Bnei Israel, it is Moshe. Right? And so here we see a slightly different command from Hashem about how to get the water. Right? Here it says, Kach et hamateh, you and also Aaron take the staff, the rod, assemble the people, and order the rock, the dibartem el hasela, to give the water to the people. And that is how you will take the water, and you'll provide drinks for the congregation and for their animals, for their beasts. And so here, right, notably, people often note, right, that in the first story, we strike the rock, and in the second, we have to talk to the rock, and poor Moshe probably just assumed it was the same. But here, like, I think it's very clear what God says, that you should take this stick or rock, and you should pass before the people and bring the water out, right? And we know that Moshe, of course, doesn't do that, and what results is being unable to enter the lands of Egypt, of Israel, man, like Bnei Israel, going backwards, not forwards. And the question, right, is why? Is like, was hitting the rock such a bad thing? What did it symbolize? Like, what's behind it, right? And again, like thinking about how we react with our own people in life, not just our children, but our spouses or our partners or our coworkers, right? When someone sort of blows up for no reason, you could say like, gosh, what's wrong with you? Or you'd be like, what's going on today, right? When I first learned some of this Parsha story, the person who told it talked about moving from the East Coast, where people are very aggressive often, to the Midwest, where people are often much calmer and nicer, and how she yelled at a DMV employee. And instead of the employee yelling back, as they would have in New York, the woman at her DMV said, honey, are you having a bad day? Right. And she said like, oh, yes, I am having a bad day. I'm so sorry. Right. And so you've got to wonder, like, what was the sin behind the bad day as opposed to the action? Because in some ways, like, it feels like it doesn't line up. Hitting the rock, not hitting the rock. It's not like hitting a person. Right. And so perhaps one of the interesting distinctions here is that it's in the stick. It's in the rod, the mateh, that we have to bring. So let's remind ourselves which staffs these are. So in Shemot Yud Zayin, which is where the first incident took place, right? God says at the end here, "V'kach itcha miziknei Yisrael umatcha asher hikiti bo et hayaor." You should take the rod with which you struck the Nile, and perhaps that staff represents like a very fierce or sort of aggressive God, right? The God who had the 10 commandments and the God who splits the sea in such a dramatic way. It's a God certainly of vengeance, right? God at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim kills all of the firstborn of Egypt, collapses the sea back on top of the army of Egypt, and that there's something about like that show of power. And again, thinking about Bnei Israel as recently freed slaves, maybe that display of power is what they needed in Shemot Yud Zayin, right? They needed the God who is like firm and harsh and hits the rock and doesn't talk to the rock, right? But what is the staff that we are supposed to take here in Bamidbar Kaf. Right here it says Kach ata mateh, and the Rashbam helps us out. He says, which mateh is this? Milifnei ha'edut. The staff that was reposing next to the tablets, next to the Ten Commandments. And so here, just to remind you, we can look back. Helpfully, the Rashbam gives us a citation. What is this? This is right after the end of all of the rebellion that we spoke about last week, about Korach and then about Datan and Aviram. God says to Moshe, to hashev et mateh Aharon lifnei ha'edut, to put Aaron's staff back before the edut, before the Ten Commandments in the Mishkan. And so what happened here, just to remind everyone from last week, right, is that at the end of the whole rebellion story, after Korach and his people are swallowed by the earth and the fire and all of the anger, right, God brings a plague which kills many, many people, 14,000, I think. Right, and it only stops when Aaron brings his offering. Then God tells Moshe to gather all the staffs of all the tribal leaders, including Aaron. And Aaron's staff, it has this like beautiful thing happen where it's an almond branch and it blossoms. And so there's this idea that Aaron's staff is like a hopeful sign, a sign of something sort of more gentle and growth and something more peaceful, right? And all of those staffs are put into the Lifnei Ha'edut, and that it's then, the reason for that, right, is, knocked over my stand here, is that it's a sign, it's an oath, Livnei Meri, to all of the rebels, like all the people who might have agreed with Korach, but not explicitly or quietly agreed with Datan and Aviram, but hadn't been killed by the plague. And it is to remind them that they should not do these things because they will die. And so it's, saying that this is like a God of love might be a little strong because it's such a strong message to rebels that they won't die. But there seems to be something that's less about this display of like overt power of splitting the sea, of creating the plagues, and something that's more about like this human repair and relationship between God and Bnei Israel, where there's like meant to be some kind of promise of not dying, right? Of not rebelling, of having some kind of peacefulness between the people, right? And so let's take like a moment, right? To think, right? So the first act is when Bnei Israel is very anxious. They've just come out of Egypt. They need some kind of reassurance that God can bring water out of a rock by hitting it. That's sort of the language that they relate to. And that then 39 years later, God recognizes that perhaps Bnei Israel are in a different place and they don't need the mateh of the Nile, of the Yaor. They need the mateh that Aaron had used as this lesson to somehow repair the relationship. It seems like in some way God is saying, look, let's take this symbol as like a nod to where we are now. And that God and that people and that relationship are in a place where they don't need a violent display of power. They need a talking to the rock. They need some kind of communication with the rock instead. I just spoke for like a super long time. Does anyone have thoughts, questions? Okay. So in that mind frame, right, we can see here, and I think that, right, this is like the thing behind the action, right? It's not so bad that Moshe hit the rock, but God is pretty explicit about what frustrated him, right? And interestingly also, right, Moshe and Aaron gather the people, and Moshe says to them, Shim'u na hamorim, listen, you rebels, right? Sort of, it seems like Moshe is the one also who is unable to break that paradigm of like stark contrast, right? God of power, enemies and not enemies, rebels and not rebels, right? Perhaps Bnei Israel were not really being rebellious. They were being anxious about the water, right? And that's a different, he misunderstood like where he was in Bnei Israel's journey. And so sure enough, instead of talking to the rock, Moshe hits the rock because that's what he did in the first instance where Bnei Israel needed that, but he missed the growth that had come out of the last 39 years. And he didn't realize that he could have done it in another way. And so sure enough, if you jump down to this side of the Samech, right, God says to Moshe and to Aaron, because lo ha'amantem bi, because you didn't trust me enough to affirm my own sanctity before Bnei Israel, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them, right? It's somehow that you misunderstood where my relationship was with the people. You didn't display or like lead the people in their display of trust and faith, which we should have at this point, right? Like we've grown to the place where we had that thing. And so Moshe could have said, look, your relationship with God has changed. You no longer need to hit the rock to get the water. We don't need to use the mateh of the Nile. We can use this beautiful cherry blossom and we can talk to the rock and use the God of sort of reconciliation or negotiation of a new place after the rebels are gone. But for Moshe, the rebels just stay, right? He is so entrenched in his relationship with Bnei Israel. And so, right, perhaps it's not really about hitting the rock or not hitting the rock. Explicitly, it's in transmitting the wrong message, right? God wanted this message of reconciliation, and instead he got, his translator gave the message of anger or of vengeance or justice or whatever. And on some level, we could say like, yeah, Moshe's having a bad day. Let's not lose sight of the fact that Miriam is his sister, right? It's not just the leader of the people. They're on the edge of going into Israel. And yet again, like something has come up that has caused the people to grumble, right? Lots of things there. But I think that the real thing there is that like as leaders, we don't always have that flexibility, right? When you are in charge of a group or a people. And so it becomes very, you're held to a higher level. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that the Rambam really jumps on this idea of Moshe as a man of anger. And he uses this space and other spaces, because Moshe gets angry often, to talk about like what happens when you are angry. And I think that that's an interesting and like deeper message, right? Like to learn not to hit each other or hit rocks or right, to have those displays as sort of, it's good not to have public temper tantrums and it's good not to be aggressive, but to think about it in this way, I think is interesting. So I thought we could look at these two sources from the Rambam. So the first one is from the Shmona Prakim, and it says that God found fault with Moshe, that such a man as he should show anger in the presence of the entire community of Israel, where wrath is unbecoming. I am a person who really does not like yelling. That's not to say I don't argue, but like when Will and I first started dating, I was like, you have to stop yelling. Like I can't even engage in this conversation, right? So I think maybe this really speaks to me. I have many, many faults, I am sure, but I really don't like displays of anger, right? Because this was a profanation of God's name, because men imitated the words and context of Moshe, hoping thereby to attain temporal and eternal happiness, right? Like when people look up to us, and I think, right, obviously Moshe as like the greatest leader of all time, but everyone has a follower somewhere. Everyone, I promise. And so, right, when someone looks up to you and then you do this, they sort of imitate your conduct and you end up in a bad place. How could he then allow his wrath free play, since it is a hurtful characteristic? When Moshe said or did anything, they subjected his words or actions to the most searching examination. Therefore, when they saw that he waxed wrathful, they said, God is angry at us for demanding water. However, we do not find God was angry when he spoke to Moshe about this. Right. And actually, in both situations, I don't think God is really upset about the water. He might be upset about the way that the anxiety was presented, but God God, if Moshe is supposed to be representing God, and if truly all of us are supposed to be representing God on some level, but being B'Tselem Elohim in the created in the image of God, that when we act angry, we portray a God who is angry when God is in fact not angry. And that's like a big thing to take on in the world, right? But I think often we think about like, because God is merciful, we should be merciful. Because God is just, we should be just, right? Like sort of the positive attributes. And thinking about the fact that if God, the idea is for God not to be angry, that then if we display anger, we sort of misrepresent God in the world. It's a really compelling idea. And the Rambam takes it a step further in the Mishnah Torah in his Hilchot Deot, where he says anger is an extremely evil tendency and it's proper for man to remove himself from it to the other extreme. One should teach himself not to get angry, even over a matter which befits anger, right? There are times like we're allowed to be upset, but not to be angry. It reminds me, my mom had a teacher growing up who, if you said you were mad, she would say, people get upset, dogs get mad, right? That there's like this sort of non-human element to like the word mad. Like you could be upset, you could be even maybe angry, but you can't be mad. Sort of, I hear the Rambam saying you could get upset, you just can't get angry, or you can't display that anger. If one desires to engender awe in his children, in his household, or in the public, if he be at the head of a community, even if he desired to get angry at them so as to bring them back to the good way, he should only act angry in their presence so as to reprove them, but his disposition must remain calm within himself. Right. And as a parent, I very much take that to heart. Like if your kid does something very dangerous, sometimes you have to say to them, you have to like act fierce because you don't want them to touch the stove again or run in the street. But like, it's not good to teach your children out of anger, right? That like, it's only as a tool. Even as a man imitates who is angry when the time calls forth anger, but in reality, he is not angry. The sages of yore said, he who yields to anger is as if he worshipped idolatry, right? Like, so, and now I think, right, that picture sort of, if that's how the Rambam really feels, like, of course, Moshe couldn't go into Israel as the leader, right? And they also said, and I think this is like this distinct nod to Moshe, whoever yields to anger, if he be a wise man, his wisdom leaves him. And if he be a prophet, his prophecy leaves him. Right? Something about being angry when God was not telling Moshe to be angry made it so that his nevi'ut left him, right? And if Moshe is a prophet because of that relationship to God and because of his ability to have that kind of prophecy, then he really wasn't a very effective leader once it had left him. And I think that this is very strong and harsh. You know, I don't want to minimize that, the language of the Rambam. And the Rambam is someone who really wanted everyone to sort of be ascetic. And like, I think anger probably clouded that asceticism on some level. But I think that there is something to that, right? If you lose it too many times in public, like people don't trust your judgment anymore. And it seems like hitting the rock, especially when you think about like how he calls them, right? Listen, you rebels. There is something that was a little bit, he lost it. He lost it one too many times for God to feel like he had the standing that he needed in front of Bnei Israel to go into the land of Egypt. And so although it remains heartbreaking for sure, I think that the heartbreakingness is not that Moshe did a little thing wrong and got a big punishment, but was that Moshe really truly wasn't able to journey himself out of that first year mentality into a 39th year mentality. I think your question is an excellent one, Mark. And I was thinking about it a lot this morning because there are places where I think, right, God acts angry. And sometimes I think like, wow, God is being so petty in that instance. I just felt it once over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember what the instance was in the Parsha. And I think like, oh, is that a tool that God is using at that moment? Or is God in some way, you know, not sometimes I don't want to say anything too heretical on the recording, right? But is this a nod to saying God is using this as a tool, or is this a nod to saying this was a mistake? that God should not have behaved that way, because whatever it was, I think it was about Miriam and Sarat. It's like a piece that I really think about a lot. It feels to me like God exaggerated, right? They were like complaining about their sibling. Moshe doesn't even seem to care. Moshe is the one who's able to be the bigger person and say, Kelna Rafana La, right? Like, I think one of the most beautiful psukim in the Torah, right? Please, God, heal her, even though you punished her because of what she did to me, right? I think God comes off as sort of the petty one there. And I wonder what that display of anger was about or not about. So I don't know. I think that there are so many, right? Even in Korach, God killed 14,000 people. I don't think it's small. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the answer, is that we just aren't able to speak about that kind of display with any other kind of language. And so what does it mean to imitate God in that instance? And what would it mean to take the word angry or wrathful sort of out of the conversation? And how would we then reimagine what was happening in that instance, whatever the instance was? I don't know. I mean, I think anger is sometimes a useful tool, right? We watch Inside Out a lot in our family, which I highly recommend. Is that what it's called? I think that's what it's called, right? And the anger guy is useful, just like the sadness person is useful and the happiness person. Like our emotions help us regulate our inside and also our actions. I think that it's not that you can't be angry. It's that you can't show that anger in such like a strong way that it's a mismatch with your audience, maybe. I don't know. But I think I am uncomfortable when I see that strong, like the strength of behavior from God or from anyone in the Parsha. And so this Maimonides sort of resonated with me in that way, but that also it helps you understand more about Moshe. Like Moshe was a person who couldn't stop being angry, right? Sometimes like you feel like I say to Davidi, right? Like the time has passed. Like we don't have to be upset about that. Like you got what you wanted and we moved on. And that was an hour ago, right? But like Moshe couldn't seem to shake that gut go-to reaction. I don't know. And maybe that's the piece that's hard. And that is a piece that certainly I and everyone I'm sure can work on some way or another, is like reacting to the moment and not to the, right? Like when you throw in like, but well, 6 years ago, I tried to do that and you didn't want to. And so now I'm going to say no too, right? And certainly I'm guilty of that as well. But like reacting in the moment and sort of recognizing when things change or when we change or when our opposition changes can be a very hard thing. And that it's sad that Moshe just demonstrates it in such a, he demonstrates the wrong way of handling it, but that we could learn the right way from that, maybe.
I'm sort of struck, this is like a tangent sort of related thought. I remember my mother once telling me that she had a friend who told her before she had children that if she ever like wanted to strike her children, she should only hit her children when she wasn't angry, which my mother thought was like, it remains perplexed by this piece of advice because you know they've never been one for corporal punishment, but she was like, when I'm not angry, I would never have any desire to hit my child. Like so just sort of reflecting on sort of, yeah, if Moshe hadn't been angry, how it seems like some actions, it's almost like this imitation of anger. I feel like to some extent there's still like a logical limitation, because you're like, if you're not angry, I don't like, why would you choose a particular course like this? So yeah, I don't know. So
yeah, I have heard that before too. And I've even heard it like extended to other things, right? Like if you're really angry, that's not the time to like talk to your kid about what they did wrong either, right? Right. I guess if you think that there is like a benefit to that physical reminder of the wrongdoing, like it is better not to do it when you're angry, because then you could be more measured and you can be more careful, whatever the thing is. I don't know. It does sound funny to those who don't believe in corporal punishment, but I think that idea is that sometimes you might do the same thing, but as long as you don't have that like sort of unbecoming display of anger, it will be better received, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think navigating these things as a leader is obviously the hardest, but even as just a human, figuring out like when to show your feelings versus not to show your feelings, right? Those are like really hard things to choose, especially in the moment, and especially 39 years of like repetitive complaining later. But that realizing that sometimes they're the right words, right? That you can act angry, but that you have to be calm to like sort of have control, I think maybe is part of the point. And I think from my own perspective, thinking like, when can you use the almond branch even to teach a lesson, right? As opposed to needing to use like the rod of the Nile is instructive anyway, right? We all have our toolboxes, and sometimes like we impulsively grab for the wrong tool. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
I was just wondering, because this takes place right after God has the earth swallow up Korach, and the fire comes out from the fire pans and burns everybody to a crisp. Pretty angry response.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Even some of the language is the same about the gathering, assembling the congregation, right? That Korach sort of assembles people. There's certainly echoes. I think like we read these things sort of piecemeal over time, but like the reverberations of last week's parsha must be very strong. It seems like both, like maybe that's why Bnei Israel just grumbles, right? Like maybe they're a little bit nervous, right? They quarrel, but they're not like outwardly rebelling, right? Because they saw what happens to rebellers. And 14,000 people, I mean, you must have known many of the people who died in the plague, right? That followed. And yet they need water to drink. And so it doesn't feel unreasonable of Moshe to think that this would be the response based on what God did to Korach. I agree with you. And what does it mean about God again, right? Like to say that God felt like that kind of display was necessary. And if God wasn't angry, right, if that's sort of the route we're taking, but felt that the community needed to see Korach be swallowed by the earth, that's also, I think, still a hard thing to grapple with. I think that and this is true like of all relationships, right? Like the dance of Bnei Israel's growth and how they relate to God and how God relates back to them, and how Moshe, right? Like often like Moshe and Aaron come begging God to stop the plague, right? So that's like a place where they're not angry, even though they could have been, right? And Moshe pleads with God to cure Miriam, even when he should have been the one who was upset. And so certainly God displays wrath, but perhaps if we trust that God is only doing it to teach a lesson, but God is really calm, right? I don't know. It's hard to imagine that. Kind of like in the hitting your children, right? If you swallow them up by the earth, like how calm could you really be at that moment? I don't know. But of course, we're not divine. So. For better and worse, I'm sure.
I think another petty, maybe it was just the quality of my translation, but I think later in this parsha where like God sends fiery serpents to like sting people. Oh, that was another moment where I was like, wow, this seems extreme. So, although I think he later, maybe it was some detail that was lost by reading it in English, but later he then, apologizes, recants, brings the people who were killed by the fiery serpents back to life. But still, yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's as always, it's so hard to emulate God when you don't really know how, when we're not divine beings.
Well, the last part of that, I don't know if that is a long quote, sorry, but it says he performs, so it's basically all misunderstanding of God to call him angry, jealous, et cetera, et cetera. The last part of the quote says he performs acts similar to those which, when performed by us, originate in certain psychical dispositions and jealousy, desire for retaliation, revenge, or anger. They're in accordance with the guilt of those who are to be punished and not the result of any emotion.
Right, how we perceive other people certainly does not always match up with how they intend for the message to be. I mean, that's also definitely true. It kind of reminds me, I had a roommate in college who worked for the Reconstructionist Hebrew school in town. And there, instead of saying God is just, they said justice is godly, because they felt, the like Reconstructionist leaders there felt like you couldn't say that God was just in a world where so many terrible things happened. And so it was easier to say justice is godly. And I feel like actually what the Rambam is saying here and the Moreh Nevuchim is like, we don't understand always what it means to say God is just, but God is, right? Even if God doesn't appear that way to us as like mere mortals, right? In some ways, like the Reconstructionist movement took an easier way out by reframing it than the Rambam is willing to do. But it sort of feels the same, right? We don't always understand what it means to say God is jealous or just, right? Vengeful or merciful, whatever the words are. But that doesn't mean that they're not true of God. And that's, sort of like the DMV lady saying, are you having a bad day, right? Like if we could respond to God, right, when we perceive wrath or anger or jealousy or whatever, and say, it must be sort of that we must be misunderstanding that emotion. I don't know. In some ways, it feels like cutting God a lot of slack. And in other ways, it feels like a very powerful lesson.
It's going to make me think. I'm thinking about this quote from the Rambam, and I think it's going to keep me busy for a while. But I think his whole thing in the guide in the Moreh Nevuchim is anthropomorphism in the Bible, and sort of trying to understand it, and that it's just our own limitation of the limitations of human language. But still, it's fascinating to think that it's the way we would think about God. I don't know. It's sort of a second order of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I love your example of the driver's license, the Secretary of State or whatever.
Yeah, the DMV. Yes, not mine, but a friend's. Yes. And it's true, like how often do we wish that someone would say to us, are you having a bad day, instead of responding to our anger, right? Like I think that...
I assume a lot of you have seen Ushpizin. I mean, it's a film I show in my Israeli film classes, but it's does everybody know the film? It came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it's with what's his name? Shuli Rand, the actor. And the sub theme is it was all about anger management. So I just thought it'd be an interesting film he was a rough hoodlum kind of guy growing up as a kid. That's the story in Eilat. And his whole thing in life is to get in control of his anger, and his rabbi is trying to get him to control his anger. And anyhow, that's what it made me think about.
Yeah. I think control, right, is often thought of as a good thing. Which is, the truth is in Inside Out, I'm thinking also, right? Like it is sort of about like choosing and managing which emotions to use at which time. Yes, and Moshe clearly, I have to admit, I've never seen Ushpizin. Like I knew the premise. But
I'll send you I've uploaded it. Well, I use it for academic purposes, so it's fine. I have a link I can send you. You should definitely watch it. And the character's name is actually Moshe Balanga.
Interesting. I wonder if that is.
You should definitely watch it. It's a great movie to watch.
Yeah.
I'll send you a link.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot to chew on in this week's Parsha. Thank you for coming. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and early Shabbat Shalom. And we'll see you next week. Should I not have a baby by Monday, we're planning to do Torah on Tap about the 3 weeks, sort of anticipating the 3 weeks coming up. And then next Wednesday, also planning to do Parsha. All right, guys.
Thank you so much.
Be healthy. Thank you.